The last man in Picher. The water tower still stands, rust-streaked and defiant against the Oklahoma sky. Pichergorrillas. It reads in faded letters, advertising a high school that no longer exists in a town that has vanished from the map. Gary Linderman looks up at it one last time from his truck window, then puts the vehicle in gear and drives away down Main Street, a street lined with nothing but empty lots and cracked pavement stretching into nowhere. It's May 10th, 2015. Gary is 78 years old. He's leaving Picher, Oklahoma, the town where he was born, where he raised his family, where his wife is buried. He's one of the last 6 people still living here. By next year, he'll be the only one, and the year after that, there will be nobody. This is the story of how an entire American town disappeared, not in some distant past, not mysteriously overnight, but slowly, deliberately, inevitably in our lifetime. Gary's grandfather, William Linderman, arrived in Picher in 1916. He was 23 years old, a farmer from Kansas who'd heard about the boom. Everyone had heard about the boom. They'd found lead, not just a little, one of the richest concentrations of lead and zinc ore ever discovered in North America. The Tri-State Mining District, they called it, encompassing parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, and Picher was at the heart of it. This was 1916. World War I was raging in Europe. Armies needed bullets, lead. They needed brass for shell casings, zinc. They needed enormous quantities immediately at any price. Mining companies descended on northeastern Oklahoma like locusts, and workers followed. William Linderman stepped off the train into a town that had been empty prairie 2 years earlier and was now home to 10,000 people. Within 2 years, it would be 20,000. Picher became one of the wealthiest towns per capita in the United States. Millionaires were made overnight. William didn't become a millionaire, but he did well. He worked in the mines 6 days a week, descending into the earth with hundreds of other men, extracting ore in tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the surface. It was dangerous work. Cave-ins happened, men died. But it was good work, steady work, work that paid better than farming ever had. He married a local girl, Ruth, in 1918. They bought a house on Main Street in 1920. 3 stories, electric lights, indoor plumbing. Things William's parents had never dreamed of. His son, Robert, Gary's father, was born in that house in 1921. By then the boom was already fading. The war had ended. Lead and zinc prices had collapsed. Mining companies that had been extracting ore frantically suddenly scaled back. Some closed entirely, but Picher didn't die. The ore was still there, billions of pounds of it. Peacetime industries needed lead and zinc for batteries, paint, galvanized steel, plumbing. The demand was lower but steady. Picher became a blue-collar mining town, not wealthy anymore but stable. Robert Linderman grew up playing in the streets, attending Picher schools, graduating from Picher Cardin High School in 1939. He went to work in the mines like his father, like most men in Picher. He married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, in 1942, right before shipping out to World War II. He came back in 1945, returned to the mines, and in 1947, Dorothy gave birth to Gary in that same house on Main Street where Robert had been born. 3 generations of Lindermans, all living in the same house, all working in the same mines, all part of the same community. Roots don't get much deeper than that. Gary grew up in the Picher of the 1950s, a town of about 6,000 people by then, smaller than its peak but still thriving. The mines were still operating, though at reduced capacity. Main Street had stores, restaurants, a movie theater, a pharmacy. The high school had a football team, the Gorillas, that Gary played for in the early 1960s. He remembers summer days playing on the chat piles, enormous mounds of mine tailings, the crushed rock left over after extracting ore. Some of these piles were 200 feet high, mountains of waste right in the middle of town. They were the highest points around, perfect for sledding in winter, for dirt-clod fights in summer. Nobody told the kids it was dangerous. Nobody knew. What Gary didn't know, what nobody in Picher knew in the 1950s, was that those chat piles were toxic. The mine tailings contained high concentrations of lead, zinc, and other heavy metals. The piles did what loose material does in Oklahoma. They blew around in the wind. Lead dust settled on houses, yards, gardens, playgrounds. Children breathed it, played in it, tracked it into their homes. The lead leached into the groundwater, into the wells people drank from, into the soil where they grew vegetables. For decades, the entire town of Picher was slowly being poisoned, and nobody noticed. Gary graduated from Picher Cardin High School in 1965. He got a job in the mines like his father and grandfather before him. He married a Picher girl named Linda in 1967. They moved into an apartment at first, then bought a house 3 blocks from his parents in 1970. Their daughter, Jennifer, was born in 1972. Their son, Michael, in 1974. Gary remembers those years as good years. The mines were still operating, work was steady. The town was smaller than it had been, sure, but it was home. People knew each other, looked out for each other. That's what small towns did. Then in 1979, doctors from the federal government came to Picher and started testing children's blood. The results were horrifying. More than 1/3 of the children tested had lead levels high enough to cause serious health problems. Some had levels that would typically only be seen in industrial workers directly handling lead. Jennifer Linderman, age 7, had lead levels 3 times the threshold for intervention. Michael, age 5, had levels 4 times the threshold. Gary and Linda were devastated. Their children had been poisoned and they hadn't known. How could they not have known? The source was obvious, the government doctors explained. The chat piles, the contaminated soil, the poisoned water. Living in Picher was slowly killing people. In 1980, the Environmental Protection Agency designated Picher as one of the first Superfund sites in the country, areas so contaminated they required federal cleanup intervention. The EPA's assessment was grim. The entire town was sitting on toxic waste. The soil was contaminated. The water was contaminated. The dust in the air was contaminated. The federal government recommended that families with young children relocate. Gary and Linda talked about it, argued about it, cried about it, but relocate where? Their house was worth maybe $30,000 if they could find a buyer, which they couldn't. Who would buy a house in a toxic Superfund site? Gary's job was here. Linda's family was here. Their entire lives were here. They stayed. Most people did, because where else could they go? The EPA began cleanup efforts, removing contaminated soil, trying to remediate the worst areas. But the scale of contamination was massive. It would take decades, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and even then it might not be enough. Meanwhile, Jennifer and Michael were dealing with the effects of lead poisoning, learning disabilities, behavioral problems. Jennifer struggled in school despite being bright. Michael was hyperactive, had trouble concentrating. Doctors said it was likely permanent damage from the lead exposure. Gary blamed himself. He'd let his children play on those chat piles just like he had as a kid. He'd given them water from the tap without thinking. How was he supposed to know it was poison? The mining companies that had created this disaster were mostly gone. Bankrupt, dissolved, beyond legal reach. There was nobody to sue, nobody to hold accountable. The mines had extracted wealth and left poison, and the people of Picher were paying the price. By the 1990s, something else was becoming apparent. The abandoned mine shafts beneath Picher, hundreds of miles of tunnels, massive underground chambers where ore had been extracted, were collapsing. In 1967, part of a highway on the edge of town had suddenly collapsed, revealing a mine shaft directly underneath. People had been nervous then, but the collapse happened at the edge of town. Surely the mines under the residential areas were more stable. They weren't. In 1998, part of Gary's street collapsed. He woke up one morning to find a hole 30 feet across and 20 feet deep in his neighbor's yard. The house had to be evacuated. Engineers studied the area and determined that much of Picher sat above unstable mine tunnels. The collapses became more frequent. Yards would develop cracks overnight. Basement walls would shift. Roads would buckle. Families started leaving, not all at once but steadily. When a subsidence event happened near someone's home, they'd leave, sometimes abandoning the property entirely because it was unsaleable. Gary watched his neighborhood empty. The family 3 doors down moved to Tulsa in 1999. The couple across the street left in 2001. By 2005, half the houses on his block were vacant, windows boarded up, yards overgrown, for sale signs weathered and faded because nobody was buying. Main Street was dying too. The grocery store closed in 2000, the pharmacy in 2002. The movie theater had closed back in the 1980s. By 2005, there were more empty storefronts than operating businesses. Gary's parents had both died by then, his father in 1995, his mother in 2002. They were buried in the Picher Cemetery, along with Gary's grandparents and generations of Lindermans before them. Jennifer had moved to Oklahoma City in 1994, married, had kids of her own. She begged Gary and Linda to leave Picher to move closer to her, but Gary couldn't imagine it. This was home. 3 generations of his family had lived here. He'd played football for the Gorillas, had married Linda in the First Baptist Church on Main Street, had raised his kids here. How do you just walk away from that? In 2006, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted a comprehensive study of Picher's stability. Their conclusion was devastating. Approximately 86% of the town sat above mine tunnels in danger of collapse. More than half the buildings could sink into the earth at any time. The town wasn't just contaminated. It was literally falling into the ground. Still, about 1,600 people remained. Mostly older residents like Gary and Linda, people who'd lived in Picher their whole lives, who had nowhere else to go or simply refused to abandon their homes. Then came May 10, 2008. Gary was at home when the tornado sirens started. He and Linda took shelter in the interior bathroom. They didn't trust their basement anymore, not with the mine shafts underneath. They huddled there while the sky turned green and the wind began to roar. The tornado that hit Picher that evening was rated EF4 on the enhanced Fujita scale. Winds up to 200 miles per hour, 3/4 of a mile wide. It cut directly through the center of town. When Gary and Linda emerged from their bathroom, their house was still standing. Roof damaged, windows blown out but standing. They were lucky. 20 people were injured. 6 were killed, including a 7-year-old girl. More than 150 homes were completely obliterated. Another 100 were severely damaged. The high school, where Gary had played football, where his children had graduated, was reduced to rubble. The First Baptist Church was gone. Most of Main Street was destroyed. Gary walked through what remained of Picher the next day and felt like he was walking through a war zone. Debris everywhere. Cars flipped over. Houses reduced to foundations. The devastation was total, and he knew, standing there amid the rubble, that this was the end. Within days, Oklahoma Governor Brad Henry recommended that Picher be completely evacuated and shut down. The state and federal government offered buyouts to remaining residents, money to relocate, to start over somewhere else. Most people took the offer immediately. Their homes were destroyed by the tornado anyway. What was there to stay for? But Gary hesitated. Yes, his house was damaged, but it was repairable, and this was still home, still Picher. Linda had no such hesitation. "We're leaving," she told him. "We should have left years ago. There's nothing here anymore, Gary. Look around. The town is gone." "It's not gone," Gary said. "We're still here. People are still here." "Not for long," Linda said, and she was right. Between 2008 and 2009, Picher's population went from 1,600 to fewer than 100. The Lindermans' neighbors took their buyouts and left. The few remaining businesses closed. The schools shut down permanently. Gary and Linda stayed. They repaired their house with the insurance money, but they were living in a ghost town now. No stores to shop at. They had to drive to Miami, Oklahoma, 15 miles away for groceries. No neighbors, no community. Jennifer called every week begging them to leave. "Dad, you're living in a condemned town. The ground is collapsing. The air is toxic. Please, please come stay with us." But Gary couldn't do it, couldn't just abandon everything. Then in March 2010, Linda had a stroke. Gary found her collapsed in the kitchen. He called 911, but the nearest ambulance was in Miami. Picher didn't have emergency services anymore. It took 23 minutes for help to arrive. Linda survived, but she needed ongoing care, physical therapy, regular doctor visits. None of that was available in Picher. They moved to Oklahoma City in April 2010, staying with Jennifer while Linda recovered. The plan was to return to Picher when Linda was better. But Linda never fully recovered. The stroke had left her partially paralyzed on her left side. She needed help with daily activities, needed to be close to medical care. Gary rented an apartment in Oklahoma City. They stayed there for 3 years while Linda went through therapy, slowly regaining some function. Gary hated every minute of it. The noise, the traffic, the anonymity of city life. He missed Picher desperately. Linda died in November 2013. The stroke had weakened her heart, doctors said. She was 71. Gary took her body back to Picher and buried her in the cemetery next to his parents, his grandparents, 4 generations of Lindermans all in the same small plot. The cemetery was one of the few places in Picher that was still maintained, because the dead couldn't be evacuated. After the funeral, Gary walked through what remained of Picher. The population was down to fewer than 20 people. Demolition crews had torn down most of the buildings. Main Street was empty lots and rubble. His childhood home, that 3-story house where his father and grandfather had lived, had been demolished 2 years earlier. But his own house was still standing, damaged, neglected, but standing. Gary decided to move back. Jennifer was horrified. "Dad, you can't live in Picher. There's nobody there. No stores, no hospital, nothing. What if you get hurt? What if you have a medical emergency?" "I'll be fine," Gary said. I need to be home." So in January 2014, Gary Linderman moved back to Picher, Oklahoma. Population, 18. He was 77 years old, living alone in a condemned town on top of collapsing mines and toxic waste. The other residents were scattered across town. Gary might go days without seeing another person. At night, Picher was completely dark. Most of the streetlights didn't work anymore, and with so few occupied houses, there was almost no light pollution. Gary would sit on his porch and look at the stars, clearer than he'd ever seen them because the town was so dark now. And he'd think about what Picher used to be. The lights on Main Street, the sound of the high school band practicing, the way the whole town would turn out for football games on Friday nights. All of it gone. He stayed through 2014. Jennifer visited once a month, bringing groceries, checking on him, trying again to convince him to leave. "Dad, they're going to shut off the water soon. The power. You can't stay here." "I know," Gary would say. "I know." By early 2015, the population was down to 6. Gary knew all of them. Orville Ray, 83, living 2 miles away. The Johnsons, an elderly couple on the east side of town. 3 others whose names he knew but rarely saw. They were the last people in Picher. In March 2015, the water utility announced they were shutting off service. There weren't enough customers to justify maintaining the system. In April, the electric company said the same thing. Gary finally admitted defeat. On May 10, 2015, exactly 7 years after the tornado, Gary Linderman packed his belongings into his truck. He took one last walk through his house. The living room where he'd watched his children grow up. The kitchen where Linda had made breakfast every morning for 40 years. the bedroom where they'd slept together for 4 decades. He locked the door behind him, knowing he'd never unlock it again. He drove slowly down Main Street one final time, past the empty lot where the high school had been, past the rubble of the First Baptist Church, past the pharmacy, the grocery store, the movie theater, all gone, past his childhood home, now just a foundation barely visible beneath weeds. He stopped at the cemetery, stood at Linda's grave, told her he was leaving, told her he was sorry. Then he got in his truck and drove away. He looked in the rearview mirror as Picher disappeared behind him. The water tower, Picher Gorillas, was the last thing he saw before he turned onto the highway. Gary lives in Oklahoma City now, in a small apartment near Jennifer and her family. He goes to doctor's appointments, plays with his grandchildren, tries to build a life. But he's not really there. Part of him is still in Picher, still walking those empty streets, still sitting on his porch looking at the stars. He drove back once in 2019, 4 years after leaving. He wanted to see what remained. His house was gone, demolished, just a foundation and some rubble where 4 generations of Lindermans had lived. Main Street was completely empty, not a single building standing, just cracked pavement and weeds. The chat piles were still there, enormous white mountains of toxic waste against the sky. They'll be there for decades, maybe centuries, long after everyone who remembers Picher is dead. Gary walked to the cemetery. It was still maintained, still mowed, the grave still marked. The only part of Picher that remained recognizable. He sat at Linda's grave for an hour, told her about the grandchildren, about his life in Oklahoma City, about how much he missed home. Then he left. He hasn't been back since. In September 2013, the U.S. Postal Service discontinued Picher's zip code. In 2016, the Census Bureau stopped tracking it as an inhabited place. Maps are being updated to remove the town's name. As of 2024, Picher's official population is 0. The town has vanished. Not overnight, not mysteriously, but vanished nonetheless. 95 years of history, 20,000 people at its peak, thousands of families, millions of memories, all gone. Gary is 87 now. His health is declining. He knows he doesn't have many years left. Sometimes Jennifer asks him about Picher. Her children, Gary's grandchildren, have never seen it. They know their family came from a town called Picher, but it doesn't exist anymore. How do you explain that? How do you describe a place that's been erased from the map? Gary tries. He tells them about Main Street, about the high school football games, about the community they had. But it sounds like fiction, like he's describing some imaginary place. Did it really exist, Grandpa? His youngest granddaughter asked him once. Gary looked at her. This child who will never see Picher, who will grow up in a world where his hometown is just a story her grandfather tells. Yes, he said, it really existed. I lived there, I remember it. That makes it real. But for how long? When Gary dies, when the last people who actually lived in Picher are gone, who will remember it existed? The town vanished from the map. Soon it will vanish from memory, and then it will be like it never was. Gary thinks about that sometimes, sitting in his Oklahoma City apartment looking at old photographs of Picher in its heyday. The crowded Main Street, the high school, his house back when it was beautiful, all of it gone now. He keeps the photographs in a box under his bed. Sometimes he takes them out and looks through them, touching the images like he can somehow reach back through time to when Picher was alive. I'm the last one, he told Jennifer recently. Orville died last year. The Johnsons died the year before. I'm the last person who actually lived in Picher when it was still a real town. You should write it down, Jennifer said. Write down what you remember so people know what happened. Gary shook his head. Who would care? Who wants to read about a town that doesn't exist anymore? But maybe someone does. Maybe someone needs to know that Picher was real, that 20,000 people lived there, worked there, raised families there, died there, that it didn't vanish mysteriously. It vanished because mining companies extracted wealth and left poison, because regulators didn't act fast enough, because the ground collapsed from underneath, because a tornado destroyed what remained, because the contamination was so severe that the only solution was to abandon an entire community. Picher vanished because of decisions made a century ago that people are still paying for. Gary Linderman is paying for it. Living in a city he doesn't recognize, mourning a home that doesn't exist anymore, carrying memories of a place his grandchildren will never see. The last man from Picher, soon there won't even be that. The water tower still stands, visible from Highway 69 if you know where to look. Pichergorillaz in faded letters, advertising a school that's rubble in a town that's empty, for a community that's scattered. Gary saw it the last time he drove past 4 years ago. He didn't stop, didn't turn down Main Street, just kept driving, because there's nothing there anymore. Nothing but chat piles and poison and graves. The town that vanished. And soon when Gary is gone, even the memory will vanish too. Unless we remember, unless we tell the story, unless we say Picher existed, 20,000 people lived there, it was real. And what happened to it could happen anywhere, is happening in places we're not paying attention to yet. The town that vanished isn't just history, it's a warning. Remember Picher before it's too late.